video, I'm going to go over setting up your development environment from scratch, which is going to include installing Docker, registering for a GitLab account, pulling down the repository, and then finally running it and stopping it as well. So the first step is to register for a GitLab account on our Git server. You can do that by going to git.rentalcore.io and clicking on register. You do need to register using your rental core email address, otherwise it will require manual authorization. But as long as you register using your rental core email address, the process is automated. Once you do actually get the registration link, you are going to be required to set up two-factor authentication. I find that using the Google Authenticator app is the most useful for me on my iPhone. It lets you take a picture of the QR code to set up the link between two-factor authentication. But I believe there are some other solutions that you can try if you've used them in the past. So once you actually register, you can sign in. You may or may not have access to the same projects as I do. That's dependent on your role as a developer. But as soon as you log in, you will see a list of all the projects that you're currently on. So the main one that you're going to be concerned with starting out is the rentalcore/main project that contains the API code as well as the Docker Compose files that actually set up and run the development environment for you. So before we actually get into what those files are and that directory structure, the first thing you need to do is actually set up some settings in your profile. So to do that, just click on your little guy and click on Profile Settings. The first thing that you're going to need to do is add an application token, or sorry, access token. You can name this whatever you want. This is going to be a token that allows you to authenticate against the private Docker registry. You probably don't know what that is yet, but we'll get into that in a later video. Just know that you need to set up this access token in order for you to use your development machine. So you can name it whatever you want. I'll just name this test token. And you can set an expiration date on this, or you can just leave it blank. So we'll create a private access token. This is only going to be shown once, just like it says, so make sure that you copy that and put it somewhere. And if you're using LastPass or OnePass, stick it in your vault there. That's what I do. That seems to work really well. We are going to need this at a later step. For now, I'm just going to stick it in a text document. So I'm just going to stick it in Sublime here. And I'll stick this on a different window so it's not in the way. The next thing you have to do is add your SSH key from your computer. You can click on this to actually see directions on how to do it on whatever type of machine you're using. I'm on a Mac machine, or a Mac, so everything that I'm going over now is going to be specific to the Mac. If you're using a different type of machine, everything should be pretty similar. That's part of the point of us using Docker for development as well as production, in that it should run the same everywhere. But yeah, follow these directions to generate your SSH key or locate your SSH key, and then paste it in here. That's just going to let you authenticate against the Git server without manually having to type in a username and password, which won't actually work because two-factor authentication is enabled. And at least GitLab does not support authenticating against the Git server when pulling and pushing with two-factor authentication. So yeah, once you've done that, that's all that you need to do in profile settings. You can go back to the projects. And if you go open up the main application, the main project, you'll notice up here we have an SSH URL linked to the project. So that's what you're actually going to use as your Git URL. It's up to you what tools you want to use on your Mac for actually synchronizing to Git. I like using SnailGit just because I used to use Tortoise SVN when I was using SVN, and SnailGit copies a lot of the same concepts from Tortoise SVN. It provides some context menus right in the Finder, so that if I open up a project that's in Git, so let's open up the main project, I can just right-click anywhere and actually get all of the commit, pull, and push, and all the repo info right there. But for this, we're going to start from scratch. So go into some directory. I like to create a projects directory right under my user directory. Create a new folder for the project. We'll call it rental core demo. Inside of that, we're going to create a new one called main. I like to create a separate folder for each of the repositories. So you don't need to pull down the other repositories unless you need to do work on those other services. The main repository will run by itself without pulling those down. So for this whole video, I'm only going to pull down the main repository. In future videos, I'll show you how to access the other services and manipulate them. So once I've created this empty directory, I can use snail git to clone the directory. You can use whatever other interface you want. So I'm going to select that directory, the main directory there, and then that URL. So that's that SSH URL from GitLab. Recursive, yes. We're going to hit OK, and it's going to clone that repository. It shouldn't take too long. I have a pretty fast connection here. There we go. Yeah, it's a whole lot faster because we're actually using a private Git server. If you're using, well, you're not going to be using, but if you've ever used GitLab before and used GitLab.com, the speed was just terrible. And the reliability was pretty terrible, especially during peak hours. So with our private GitLab server, it's a whole lot faster. So this is the project, now pulled down. There's still a couple things that we need to do before we actually run the project. So the first thing we're going to do is actually authenticate against that private Docker registry. So just brief overview, the private Docker registry just lets us store Docker images that are only accessible to users authenticated against the project or authorized to use the project. So those will be developers, QA testers possibly, and the like. So what we need to do is, from a terminal, it doesn't matter what directory you're in, Docker login, oh sorry, actually, let me back up. Before we do that, we need to install Docker. I'm going to uninstall Docker from my machine, just so we can start fresh. So let me uninstall this really quick. So just go to Docker's website and get started with Docker. Download Docker for Mac. Once it's done downloading, install it like any other application. Once you install it and actually run it for the first time, it is going to ask for administrator credentials. That's because it needs access to the network interface. So I'm just going to replace my current installation with that. And let me ignore this really quick. So run Docker for the first time. And yes, we trust it. Yeah, so this is where it's going to ask you for your administrator password. So we'll authenticate against that. All right, yeah, got it. So once the little containers stop moving, we know that Docker is completely loaded. So it's running now. Depending on your machine, you might want to change these default settings. If you have the available RAM, I would definitely use 4 GB. 4 CPUs is definitely plenty for the application to run on, but especially with the Couchbase database, it's kind of a memory hog. So 4 GB is much better than 2 in this case. And if you can allocate even more, then that's even better. So let's wait for it to finish. Sure, it's taking a while. There we go. So now it's done. So Docker is installed. You can test that. If I spelled it right. Get your Docker version. So the first thing we need to do is authenticate against that private Docker registry. That just allows us to pull down already built images in the GitLab repos. So docker login rc.githost.io, I believe. Yes. And then it's going to ask us for a username. It'll be whatever your username is for GitLab. In my case, yeah, it's Jamie Rabia. And then the password is that that access token that we created. So use that access token, and login succeeded. You'll only have to do that once. If you uninstall Docker and reinstall Docker, you'll have to do it again. If you change development machines, of course, you'll have to do it again. But yeah, you should only ever have to do that once. So next up, we're actually going to run the application. So you can see what it looks like. And what we're going to do is we're going to run it first from the Finder interface, and then I'll show you how to run it just directly from the terminal. I prefer to run it directly from the terminal. That way I have control over starting and stopping it without having to close the terminal. Because you'll see that there's a lot of verbosity with the application when you're running it in dev. So we're just going to run start dev script, which is in the root of the repository. So you'll see start dev as well as stop dev. Start dev will start. Yeah, of course, it was downloaded, so the first time you have to right click and hit open. And you'll see the application start up. Right now it's running Docker Compose, running through Docker Compose, so it's going to pull down all of the necessary images. So you'll notice right now it's pulling down the node Docker image. So it's going to build the API first. And then it will pull down all of the other required images. Almost all of them are on our private registry. HA proxy is not on our private registry because we don't actually need to do anything special to it. We can just use the one provided by the vendor, the creator of HA proxy. So you can, as you'll see, it's listing the different steps. These steps actually match up with the build file that's used to create this image. So in later videos, I'll go over how to actually create those Docker files and how to read them and understand what they're doing. But yeah, when you build a Docker container, or Docker image, you're going to see all of these different build steps for what it's doing. And the one that takes the longest by far is actually installing all the NPM packages. So you'll notice all of this scary looking red text. That's just all of the NPM packages. First NPM is updating, and then NPM is installing the required packages. And once that's finished, still installing some more. Yeah, it's got some packages it needs to install globally. NodeMon needs to be installed globally. So you'll see a couple different steps just around the NPM package installation. And yeah, it should be getting, right now it's installing all of the regular dependencies, not the global NPM packages. So because it's installing these on the fly, we don't actually need to, and you shouldn't commit your node modules directory to the Git repository. It's in the Git ignore file, so it shouldn't if you ever create one by accident or one gets created by accident. But yeah, one of the nice things about Docker is that it'll actually use a cache. So unless there are any changes to that step, it'll actually use the cache version of that image. Of course, this is the first time that we're running this since installing Docker, so there are no cached images. But your subsequent times that you run start dev, it's going to be a lot faster. It takes seconds to come up instead of minutes in this case. Should be getting pretty close to finished here. While that's still going, I'll just briefly go over the directory structure. So the main repository has, at the top level, has all of the files required for actually running dev. So you have the dockercompose.yaml file, which is actually defining the different packet or the different Docker containers that need to run and how they're linked together. We'll go over specifically how to read that file and what it means in a later video. but just know that that file is what's defining the whole infrastructure for the development environment. There's a documentation directory which contains things like PowerPoint presentations and PDFs that have been used in past presentations. Standard README file, the start dev script, which is running right now. There's a stop dev script as well, which will stop this gracefully. Then there's a temp data directory. And that is a directory for just storing database files, so that whenever you stop and restart the development environment, you don't lose all of your database records. And those files never get committed to the Git repository, so they're specific to your machine. So there's another directory called the app directory. That's where our application or our API actually lives. So inside of that directory, we have a few more directories. We have the Docker file, which I'll go over exactly how that works in a later video. Just know that that's the file that actually defines how to create the application container. Our package.json file, which is just defining all of the package.json things, like the dependencies. There are some configuration settings in there as well. Serve.js, main application. All of our configuration files, and then all of these files specifically required for the API. And we'll go over everything inside of here in more detail in a later video. Yeah, just know that the main application is inside of this app directory, inside of the main repository, and that Docker Compose, start dev, and stop dev are all used for actually starting the environment or running the environment. So yeah, as you can see, yeah, there's a lot of verbosity. You'll see this little prefix on each line in a different color that represents the Docker container. And that's not necessarily the name of the container. The name is actually prefixed by the project, which is rc underscore. So then this container is actually rc underscore cd-init underscore 1. But you won't really need to know that until you're actually troubleshooting or you need to access a container directly. Let me close this because it's not needed. So your dev environment is now running. So if we go to localhost/check, we should get an error that says we're not authenticated or authorized yet, because of course we're not sending over any tokens right now because we're just in a browser. So your development environment is running right now. You can hit localhost. You can hit. There's a number of different files that you can hit. The most important ones for you right now are going to be the documentation. So if you go to localhost/docs, you're going to see the Swagger documentation on the API. That's going to also list all of the different routes. So let's just expand all these really quick. There are two different documentation pages that you can basically go to. There's Swagger Doc, which is the documentation specifically around the API and the routes that you can go to. You can test out the API here by actually passing over test information. And then there's also JS Docs, which is the documentation specifically around the code. And there are links between the two. There's links from JS Docs into Swagger documentation. But yeah, we'll get into that more specifically, the specifics of both of them in a later video. But just know that /docs will take you to the Swagger documentation where you can see all the different paths. So we could hit /todos. It's going to give us an error because we're not authenticated. But those are the paths that you can hit. So /docs will take you to the Swagger documentation. /JSDoc is going to take you to the JS documentation. So you'll see all the different modules and the documentation on the different functions. I don't find this super useful. I actually prefer to just look at the comments in the code to understand the documentation on the functions. But this is just JSDoc generates this while you're creating your documentation in the code anyway. So it's just there, and it's kind of nice to have. Something to note as you're developing in your local environment, whenever you save a file or make changes, NodeMon is going to restart the node server. and that's required by Node to actually have your changes affect anything. So if you make a change, so I'm just gonna open up a file in Sublime really quick. I'll go over in a later video the IDE that I like to use, but you're definitely more than welcome to use whatever IDE you want. So we're just gonna remove space, and you'll notice in our terminal we're getting a lot of verbosity about that server restarting right now. Every time it restarts, it's also going to run all of the unit tests and integration tests. So we could see that a summary of those integration tests. We'll go over the different service that's actually creating this and running the tests in a future video, but yeah, whenever you make a change to a file, you're going to get this type of output every time. So now that we've just gone over how to run the development environment, let's stop the development environment. So you can do that by just running. Of course, it's the first time I'm running it. Right-click Open for the first time, and that will stop the development environment. You'll see a new terminal window open up with the stopping script, and then you'll see the terminal from the running script start to shut down everything. You'll see slowly all of the different containers exit. And that's been complete, and this is complete, so we can close that. So that's one way that you can run the development environment. The way that I actually prefer is running it directly from the command line. So let me just go back to where you'll be. So in my case, I created that projects directory. So I'll change directories into the projects directory, and then we created, what did we call it? So we call it rentalcore_demo. I normally have all of the repositories pulled down. In this case, we only have the one. So we'll just change into main. So if we look inside of here, we can just hit /start_dev. And what that lets us do is the start dev script will account for Docker or the development environment not being shut down gracefully. So if you Control-C out of this, the next time you start it up, it's going to clean up any of the stop containers and things like that. So I just hit Control-C. It's going to take a little while because it's going to try and stop them gracefully. You'll see different outputs on this every time. Not every time, but occasionally it won't do this gracefully. It'll just quit immediately. And that's why the start dev script will handle that cleanup again. So it's not required to hit stop dev just to stop dev. You can Control-C out of it in this case. So that is starting up and running the development environment. If you have any questions, there are a couple URLs that you should be familiar with. One is that get.rentalcore.io URL. Another one is docs.rentalcore.io, and that will bring you into Confluence, which if you don't have an account here, you will need to register for one, and that is an automatic authorization process as long as you use your Rentalcore email address. But under Spaces, there was developer documentation, and there is written documentation on actually setting up your development environment. It's kind of a briefer version of what I've gone over. But there's also a list of endpoints. So these are the different services that are running, as well as, like we went over, the /docs, /JS doc, and testing environment and production environment endpoints. There are some other documents here. I mean, feel free to browse through these. Not all of these are going to pertain to your responsibilities. Some of these are actually setting up the infrastructure and not necessarily developing for it. But yeah, and all of these videos will be listed with links in the video series page. So if you ever need to reference this video or find some other videos, that is a good place to go. All right, I will see you with the next video.